So I want you to think for a second about that smartphone sitting in your pocket,
Mm.
or maybe the one you're holding in your hand right now.
Right, the device that basically dictates our whole day.
Exactly. I want you to think about the raw disruptive power it has. Like you get a push notification where you see this viral post and suddenly millions of people are all looking at the exact same thing.
Yeah, they're arguing about the same thing, feeling the exact same
Or
outrage.
inspiration, right? All at the exact same millisecond. And it feels so modern. It feels like this uniquely 21st century phenomenon.
Oh, absolutely. It feels like a tech thing.
Right. But imagine that exact same viral, world-altering energy stripped of the silicon and the screens. Imagine it's the 250 years ago,
Okay.
and all of that immense power is contained in just a simple folded ink-stained piece of paper. That's what we're getting into today in this deep dive.
It's a fascinating perspective.
It really is. We are exploring excerpts from Professor Milton Biswas's comprehensive text, America's Media Power. And his core argument, honestly, it kind of shifts our entire understanding of history.
It really does, because he argues that the media didn't just passively report on the birth and growth of America.
Right?
It actively engineered the American identity, it engineered the democratic system, the public consciousness, all of it.
Which requires a pretty massive mental shift, right?
Yeah.
To view history through that specific lens.
Completely. Because, we tend to think of the media landscape as this modern canopy that was built over an already finished nation.
Like it was added on later.
Exactly. But the architecture of how we consume information actually served as the foundation of the nation itself. We're looking at a journey from those early colonial pamphlets passing from hand to hand.
Literally passing around taverns.
Yeah, all the way to the bustling, heavily sensationalized streets of the early urban newspaper. The media was never just a mirror reflecting society, It was the mold that actively shaped it.
Okay, so to understand the mechanics of how a simple piece of paper could engineer a whole nation, we have to look at the political landscape before the United States even existed.
Right, the late 1700s.
Yeah. Back then, if you wanted to consume political discourse in Europe, you were basically reading these massive, expensive, leather-bound treatises.
Oh, yeah. They were incredibly dense, written by aristocrats for aristocrats.
Exactly. But over in the colonies, the format that sparked the revolution wasn't a massive book. It was the pamphlet.
Because the physical format of the pamphlet completely changed the spatial dynamics of political debate.
How so? Like just because it was smaller?
Well, think about it. A dense European philosophical text required a library. It required leisure time and, a classical education just to decipher the Latin references and all the legal jargon.
Right, which most people definitely did not have.
No, of course not. But the pamphlet bypassed all of those barriers. They were super cheap to produce on these small, decentralized printing presses.
So anyone could kind of get their hands on one?
Exactly. And they were lightweight, meaning they could be easily smuggled or just carried in a coat pocket on horseback across vast distances.
Which brings us perfectly to Thomas Paine and the publication of Common Sense in January of 1776.
A massively important moment.
Oh, it's huge. The sheer scale of this document's reach is staggering. Like, the source text notes that Common Sense sold somewhere between 100,000 and 500,000 copies.
Which doesn't sound like a lot today, but...
But the total population of the colonies at the time was only 2.5 million people.
Right. It's an unbelievable saturation rate.
To put that in perspective for you, that would be like a single political essay selling over 60 million copies in the United States today, in a matter of months.
It was undeniably viral.
But it wasn't just the cheap distribution that made it go viral, right?
Yeah.
Like, how did Thomas Paine actually write this thing to capture that much of the population?
Well, he fundamentally changed the rhetoric of political discourse. Because before Paine, colonial arguments against British policies were bogged down in very dense legalistic debates about the English Constitution.
Like citing old laws and precedents.
Exactly. They were respectful, they were dry, and Paine just threw all of that out the window.
Thank goodness he did.
Right. He wrote with the cadence of a sermon, which is crucial because that was the one form of public speaking almost every colonist, regardless of class, understood deeply.
So he met them where they were.
Exactly. Instead of citing abstract legal precedents, he used plain-spoken analogies. He compared the absurdity of an island ruling a continent to a satellite ruling a planet.
Oh, that's a great line.
It is. He called the king a royal brute, He used language that a farmer or a blacksmith or a merchant could instantly grasp and crucially repeat to others.
And the setting where they were repeating this is so vital, because I always pictured people sitting quietly in their parlors reading these pamphlets by candlelight.
Oh, it wasn't like that at all.
Right. The text points out that common sense was read aloud in taverns, in town squares, and at meeting houses. Because, literacy rates weren't universal.
Exactly.
So the act of consuming this media became this loud, auditory, communal event.
Yes, sociologists actually refer to this dynamic as the participatory public sphere.
Participatory public sphere. I like that.
Because when someone stood up in a crowded pub and read Paine's arguments over a pint of ale, the texts ceased to be just words on a page. It became an event.
Like a modern-day group chat or comment section almost.
Yes. The people listening weren't passive consumers. They were active participants. They debated the points. They cheered. They argued.
So it was really user-generated momentum.
Exactly. And the decentralized nature of those small printing presses meant the Crown couldn't easily shut down the flow of information. It was a grassroots, bottom-up circulation of ideas rather than a top-down decree.
It's essentially the colonial equivalent of the open source movement.
That's a really good way to frame it.
You didn't just read the news silently on a screen. You went down to the local pub, someone stood on a table, and everyone just dug into the discourse. That communal consumption actively built a shared narrative of oppression.
And eventually that became the shared narrative of rebellion.
Right, which culminated in the Revolutionary War.
Yes, but winning the war and establishing a new nation introduced an entirely new problem.
Because the printing press proved it could empower the marginalized to overthrow a monarchy. But now, the people who weaponized that press were suddenly the ones running the new government.
It's a massive shift in power dynamics.
And I have always carried this assumption, probably from high school history classes, that the Founding Fathers viewed the press as this sacred, objective watchdog.
A lot of people think that.
Right. Like once the Constitution and the First Amendment were ratified, the press just settled into this noble role as an impartial arbiter of truth, calmly keeping an eye on the new democracy.
Sounds nice, doesn't it?
Right. But wait, wasn't the First Amendment designed to protect that objective oversight?
That is a pervasive, romanticized myth, I'm afraid.
Wow, really?
Yeah. The concept of the objective, neutral journalist did not exist in the early days of the Republic. Once the Revolution ended, the press immediately morphed into a fierce, inherently partisan battlefield.
Well, they were just fighting each other.
Oh, absolutely. The early American newspapers were essentially party organs. They were often quite literally subsidized by political factions.
So we're talking about the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans.
Exactly. The Federalists, who wanted a strong central government, and the Democratic Republicans, who favored states' rights. Political leaders understood that whoever controlled the narrative controlled the mobilized support of the voting public.
Okay, so if you bought a Federalist paper, you were getting pure Federalist propaganda.
100%.
And if you bought a Democratic Republican paper, you were getting the exact opposite. It was all sharp rhetoric, satire, personal attacks.
It's incredibly vicious.
So when you look at our modern anxieties about, fake news or hyperpartisanship or living in echo chambers, those aren't modern tech problems at all.
Not even slightly. Those dynamics are older than the U.S. Constitution.
That is wild to think about.
And this hyper-partisan environment created immense friction between state authority and press freedom. The state constantly tested the boundaries of how much criticism it could actually tolerate.
Okay, give us an example, because the First Amendment is pretty clear, right?
Well, to understand how precarious press freedom was, we have to look back slightly before the nation's founding to the 1734 trial of John Peter Zenger.
Right, the Zenger trial.
Under British colonial law at the time, the concept of seditious libel operated under this terrifying principle: the greater the truth, the greater the libel.
Wait. If something was true, it was considered more libelous. How does that even work?
I know it sounds backwards to us, but the logic of the Crown was that a true criticism of the government was much more likely to incite a rebellion than a false one.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Therefore, telling a damaging truth made it a worse crime against the state.
That is incredibly twisted logic.
It really is. So, John Peter Zenger published articles criticizing the corrupt colonial governor of New York, and he was thrown in jail for seditious libel.
Because what he printed was true.
Exactly. During the trial, his lawyer made what was then a radical argument to the jury. He argued that because the criticisms were true, Zanger had a fundamental right to publish them.
And what happened?
The jury acquitted him.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, establishing the monumental precedent that truth is an absolute defense against libel.
That feels like the moment press freedom was truly born.
It was a massive turning point.
But even after the First Amendment was ratified later on to protect that freedom, the government didn't just back off, did they?
Far from it. The tension never vanished. Jump forward to 1798 under President John Adams. The government passed the Alien and Sedition Acts.
Okay, what was the excuse for that? Because that seems like a direct violation of the First Amendment they just wrote.
The geopolitical context here is crucial. The United States was in a quasi-war with France. The French Revolution had devolved into the Reign of Terror, and Adams' Federalist government was terrified that French sympathizers and critical newspapers would incite a similar bloody uprising in America.
So they panicked.
Basically. So the exact same generation that wrote the First Amendment made it a criminal offense to publish false, scandalous, and malicious writing against the government.
They used the threat of foreign instability to criminalize domestic dissent.
Precisely. And it wasn't just an empty threat. Actual newspaper editors and journalists who criticized John Adams were literally thrown in prison.
Wow. That perfectly illustrates the cyclical nature of media history, doesn't it?
It really does. Whenever there is a perceived national crisis, the state attempts to draw a line restricting the public sphere under the guise of national security.
Right.
We actually see the exact same mechanism play out over a century later during World War I. In 1919, the Supreme Court heard Schenck v. United States.
Oh, I've heard of this one.
Yeah. Charles Schenck had distributed pamphlets urging men to resist the military draft. The court upheld his conviction, with Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes establishing the clear and present danger test.
Wait, that's where the famous analogy comes from, right?
Right.
The one about falsely shouting fire in a crowded theater and causing a panic?
Exactly. The court determined that the First Amendment does not protect speech that creates a clear and present danger of bringing about substantive evils that Congress has a right to prevent.
So the state is constantly negotiating this really delicate balance between maintaining an open democratic discourse and just maintaining order.
Always. It's a constant tug of war.
Okay, so the press survives these early existential battles with the government. It secures its right to exist, even if that right is constantly being contested.
Right.
But as we move into the 19th century, the physical reality of the United States drastically changes. The country is expanding westward. It is geographically massive.
The logistics of communication completely change.
Right. Print media faces this brand new challenge. It can't just be politicians bickering in New York and Philadelphia anymore. If you have citizens spread all the way across a continent, how do you keep them connected?
It's a huge problem.
How does the press evolve into the glue that holds a rapidly expanding nation together?
Well, the answer lies in the era of print capitalism. During the 19th century, we see a massive boom in the publication of books and magazines. And this was driven by phenomenal technological shifts.
What kind of shifts?
For centuries, printing was a really laborious process. They used hand-cranked wooden presses, and the paper itself was actually made from rags, literally discarded linen and cotton clothes.
Like actual clothes?
Yes, there were constant rag shortages that bottlenecked the production of reading material.
It was literally the 19th century equivalent of a global microchip shortage. You literally could not print more books until more people threw away their old shirts.
That is an excellent comparison. That's exactly what it was like. But the Industrial Revolution solves these bottlenecks.
Thank goodness for steam power.
Exactly. We see the invention of steam-powered rotary presses. Suddenly, they can print tens of thousands of pages an hour instead of just a few hundred.
That's a massive leap.
And crucially, we see the introduction of wood pulp paper. By chemically breaking down wood, paper manufacturers had access to an almost infinite, incredibly cheap raw material.
So the cost of producing print just plummets.
Plummets. And the sheer volume of material skyrocketing out of these presses fundamentally changes the culture.
And the content changes too, right? Because you aren't just printing angry political rants anymore.
No, not at all.
The source text actually notes the founding of iconic publications like the Atlantic Monthly in 1857. They are publishing serialized fiction, poetry, essays, and cultural criticism.
They are intentionally casting a wider net to capture a much broader audience.
Right.
And this specific technological and cultural boom is what the scholar Benedict Anderson focused on when he coined one of the most vital concepts in media theory.
The imagined communities idea.
Yes. The idea of imagined communities. Anderson argued that a nation is not a naturally occurring phenomenon, Millions of people spread across a massive continent do not naturally feel a kinship with one another.
Because they'll never meet.
Exactly. A nation is socially constructed. It is imagined by the people who perceive themselves as part of that group, and the mechanism that allowed them to imagine it together was mass-produced, shared media.
Think about the mechanics of how this works. Before mass print media, your concept of community was strictly limited to the people you physically interacted with on a daily basis.
Your town, your specific trade.
Yeah, your local village.
Yeah.
But print capitalism acts almost like standardizing a national currency, except instead of standardizing money, it standardizes thought and culture.
Exactly.
You have a merchant in Boston and a farmer in Ohio. They live completely different lives with completely different local concerns. But they are reading the exact same serialized novel in the exact same magazine during the exact same week.
Yes. They are reading the same dispatch about a political event. They are seeing the exact same advertisements for the exact same goods.
So they're sharing an experience.
Print media created a shared temporal experience. It established a national rhythm of consumption. Those millions of strangers began to develop a shared vocabulary and shared cultural references.
Because when the Boston merchant and the Ohio farmer both internalized the same stories, they constructed this invisible bond.
They both developed a shared understanding of what it meant to be an American. Media wasn't just moving information from point A to point B anymore. It provided the architectural framework of the national consciousness.
I like to think of it as the Super Bowl effect.
Oh, that's a good analogy.
Think about when you watch a massive live event in your living room. You are physically sitting alone on your couch, but there is this electric, almost invisible feeling in the air.
You know everyone else is watching.
Right. You possess the certain knowledge that millions of other people are watching the exact same image, at the exact same millisecond, feeling the exact same tension. Mass print media manufactured that specific feeling for the very first time in human history.
It is a profound way to look at how societies bind themselves together. However, as we move further into the 1800s, this framework undergoes another massive economic shock.
What happened?
Because up until the 1830s, even with cheaper wood pulp paper and faster presses, daily newspapers were still mostly a luxury item.
They were still too expensive.
Yeah, they cost about 6 cents a copy, which was a significant expense for a working-class laborer. And they usually required an annual subscription paid up front.
Oh, so you couldn't just buy one on a whim?
No. So the imagined community was growing, but the daily news was still somewhat gated for the elite.
And that paradigm completely shatters in 1833. Benjamin Day launches the New York Sun.
A very famous paper.
And he introduces a gimmick that changes the trajectory of media forever. He drops the price of the daily paper from 6 cents to 1 single penny.
Which is a massive price cut.
Huge. Suddenly, the news isn't just for the affluent merchants or the political elite. It is highly accessible to the urban working masses. Thus, the penny press is born.
But dropping the price to a penny fundamentally breaks the old economic model of journalism.
Right, because how do you make money?
Exactly. You can no longer survive on subscription revenue, and you are no longer relying on the political patronage of the Federalist or Democratic Republican parties.
Because you're selling it for less than it costs to print.
Exactly. If you are selling a paper at a loss, you have to find a new revenue stream. And that revenue stream was mass advertising.
Ah, there it is.
But to command high rates from advertisers, you need to guarantee mass circulation. You need a massive volume of eyeballs on your pages every single day.
So the entire distribution model has to change. You can't rely on the mail or annual subscriptions. You put newsboys on every street corner hawking the papers directly to foot traffic.
Yes. Extra, extra. Read all about it. And more importantly, the content itself had to change to appeal to that foot traffic.
Because elite political essays weren't going to grab the attention of a factory worker walking home from a 12-hour shift.
Exactly. So editors sent reporters out into the streets for the very first time. They invented on-the-ground beat reporting.
They covered local affairs, police blotters, maritime news, and just city life in general.
And they made the language colloquial and highly accessible.
When you look at the mechanics of this, you realize Benjamin Day basically invented the attention economy.
He really did.
The penny press relied heavily on sensationalized crime, human interest stories, and local gossip. It was the absolute precursor to yellow journalism.
And it's all about the hook.
Right. The business model was straightforward. Write the most lurid, eye-catching headline possible, capture the pedestrian's attention, sell the cheap paper, and then sell that pedestrian's attention to the advertiser.
It sounds very familiar, doesn't it?
It's exactly what we do today. When you describe this ad-driven, attention-grabbing content, you can connect the penny press directly to the algorithms of the free, ad-supported apps we scroll through today.
The parallels are undeniable.
The technology evolved from newsboys on street corners to fiber optic cables, but the economic model, giving the content away for almost free to capture and sell human attention, that was perfected in the 1830s.
It absolutely commodified attention and incentivized sensationalism. It birthed a highly competitive environment where editors routinely exaggerated stories or prioritized scandal over substance simply to move units.
So let me push back a little here. How was this a democratic victory if it just lowered the intellectual value of the discourse with gossip and crime blotters? Was it just 19th century clickbait?
That's a fair critique, but you have to remember that before the penny press, the working class, immigrants, and women were largely excluded from the daily public discourse entirely.
Because they couldn't afford the 6-cent papers.
Exactly, and those papers simply didn't care about their lives anyway. The penny press, despite its many ethical flaws, gave those marginalized groups a voice and a reflection of their own existence.
Oh, I see.
Because reporters were actually out on the street, they began to cover municipal corruption. They held local power accountable in a way the elite, philosophically detached partisan papers never bothered to do.
So it forced the city to look at itself.
Yes, it fundamentally expanded the boundaries of who was considered an informed citizen. So yes, it was messy, but it was a profound democratization of access to information.
That is fascinating. Let's take a step back and look at the incredible arc we've just tracked today. We started with Thomas Paine's Common Sense, a cheaply printed pamphlet that weaponized plain-spoken analogies to give ordinary people the language to imagine a revolution.
Right.
From there, we watched the press navigate the intense, hyper-partisan battlefields of the early republic, constantly testing the boundaries of state authority against laws like the Alien and Sedition Acts.
And then we examine how the industrial mechanics of the steam press and wood pulp paper allowed magazines and books to become the cultural glue of an expanding country.
The imagined communities.
Exactly. They allowed millions of geographically isolated strangers to sync up their realities and participate in a shared national identity.
And finally, we arrived at the chaotic streets of 19th century New York with the penny press. It democratized access to the daily news for the working class while simultaneously inventing the sensationalist, ad-driven attention economy that still governs our media today.
Which perfectly validates Professor Biswas's core thesis. The media did not sit on the sidelines and passively document the American experiment.
No, it was the engine of that experiment.
It taught citizens how to argue, how to belong to a broader community, and what to actually care about. The history of the United States is entirely inseparable from the history of its printing presses.
Which brings us all the way back to that smartphone sitting in your pocket. We talked heavily about Benedict Anderson's concept of imagined communities. We explored how the print capitalism of the 18th and 19th centuries built the nation by standardizing what everyone read.
Right.
The merchant in Boston and the farmer in Ohio read the same headlines at the same time, syncing up their realities and establishing a shared baseline of facts and narratives. The media unified the national consciousness.
It gave everyone a shared reality.
Exactly. So here is the question for you to take with you today. If the shared mass media of the past built our imagined community, what happens to our shared reality today?
That's a big question.
Now that modern algorithms give every single person a completely different, custom-tailored news feed based entirely on what keeps them individually clicking, are we slowly unimagining the community?
It's definitely something to think about.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the media you consume, keep looking for the mold behind the mirror, and we'll catch you next time.